June 16, 1944, southern coast of Saipan. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still clung to the skin like wet cloth. Heat shimmered above the black volcanic sand, thick with the smell of diesel, salt, and cordite. In the darkness, only the faint red glow of cigarettes and the dull hum of insects marked time. American Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines were dug into their foxholes, their boots sunk in mud and coral shards, their rifles resting on sandbags slick with sweat and grime. Every man knew something was coming. They just didn't know when. Corporal Jack Merrill lay flat in his pit, fingers drumming on the steel tube beside him. The M1A1 bazooka, nearly as long as he was, sat across his lap like a coiled animal. His loader, Private Edgar Navarro, wiped condensation from the launcher's rear assembly with the edge of his sleeve. Navarro whispered without looking up. "You think they'll send tanks tonight?" Merrill didn't answer. He'd seen what happened on Guam, on Tarawa, and the faces of the men who hadn't been ready. 200 yards ahead, beyond the forward tree line, Imperial Japanese Army tanks were lining up. Their engines rumbled like distant thunder under the canopy of palms and breadfruit trees. Type 95 Hago light tanks, their riveted hulls caked with jungle filth, idled alongside the heavier Type 97 Chiha mediums. Japanese officers watched the beach positions with binoculars, their uniforms neatly pressed despite the humidity. They'd laughed at captured American bazookas earlier that week, mocking the crude tubes as useless toys. An infantry weapon that could kill armor? Impossible. Their doctrine said so. Lieutenant Colonel Sakai Shiga stood on the back deck of a Type 97, one gloved hand resting on the turret hatch. Around him, tank crews buckled into their leather helmets, tightening chin straps and murmuring prayers to ancestors. The plan was simple: punch through the Marine lines under cover of darkness, crush their weak armor support, and drive them back to the waterline before sunrise. Shiga had argued that American infantry lacked the firepower to halt armored assaults. Even the few M3 Stuarts the Americans brought ashore could be swarmed and destroyed. Bazookas? He scoffed at the very mention. Back on the beach, Merrill pressed his ear against the ground. He didn't hear voices or boots, he felt vibration. Faint at first, then steady. Tracks. Navarro stiffened. "You feel that?" Merrill nodded once and slid the tube onto his shoulder. Around them, other Marines pulled pins from grenades and cinched down their chin straps. The night was so still that every breath sounded like a shout. Farther down the line, a machine gun team rotated their Browning M1919 toward the trees, the assistant gunner feeding the belt with hands he tried to keep from shaking. Someone muttered a Hail Mary. Someone else clicked off the safety on a bar. Still no flares, no searchlights, no warning shots. Then the jungle lit up, headlights snapping on in staggered rows, shafts of yellow cutting through smoke and leaves. The roar of engines surged as the tanks lurched forward, fanning out into assault formation. The ground trembled under the weight of steel. Tree branches cracked. Brush flattened. Japanese infantry jogged behind them in shadows, rifles slung, bayonets fixed. Merrill's heart thudded against his ribs, but his voice was steady when he hissed, "Load." Navarro slid the rocket into the launch tube and tapped the barrel twice. The bazooka's firing contact scraped his palm. The rocket's fins glinted faintly in the darkness. 50 yards. The tanks advanced without pause, confident nothing ahead could stop them. Lieutenant Colonel Shiga watched from his command tank, convinced that American anti-tank defenses were limited to artillery and shore guns miles offshore. He had dismissed rumors of portable launchers that could punch through armor. Infantry weapons were for infantry. Tanks were for breaking infantry. 30 yards. The lead Type 95 angled toward a cluster of sandbags, its hull machine gun spitting short bursts into the night. Dirt kicked up near Merrill's position. Navarro's breathing quickened, but his hands held firm. "On me," Merrill whispered, sighting down the tube. The rocket tip hovered in his vision, aligned with the tank's upper hull plate. The engine noise drowned out everything. Shouts, gunfire, insects, even fear. 20 yards. The driver of the Type 95 couldn't see the two Marines tucked behind the low-rise. In his mind, nothing short of high-caliber fire could pierce his armor. He shifted gears, confident, the commander scanning with binoculars for silhouettes to crush beneath treads. Merrill exhaled. His finger tightened, tore from the tube with a shriek and a flash that seared the night. The backblast scorched Navarro's sleeve and sent a plume of dust and smoke curling into the air. The projectile crossed the gap in a blink and slammed into the Type 95's side armor just below the turret ring. There was no ricochet, no ping of steel deflection. Instead, the shaped charge punched through the thin plate like paper. A bloom of white-orange fire erupted from the impact point. The crew inside barely had time to scream. The turret rocked as flame burst from the commander's hatch, and the engine compartment clanged with expanding metal. The tank lurched to a stop, tracks grinding uselessly before going still. A second later, the ammunition inside cooked off in a muffled thump. Lieutenant Colonel Shiga's eyes widened. He had expected sporadic rifle fire, maybe grenade blasts, but not a tank erupting into fire so fast it didn't even complete its charge. He barked into his field phone, ordering the next line to accelerate and run down whatever had fired. Merrill was already reloading. Navarro slammed another rocket into the tube with more force than he needed, his hands trembling with adrenaline. "Left," Merrill snapped. A second Type 95 came into view, angling toward a machine gun nest. Its turret swiveled, firing tracers across the ridge, cutting into sandbags and chewing through a tripod. The Marines in that nest scrambled as dirt exploded around them. Merrill steadied his breathing, sighted again, and fired. The second rocket streaked low, smashing into the tank's front glasses. The detonation blew the driver's vision block clean off. Flames poured through the seams in the armor, licking up around the turret like hands dragging it into the earth. Farther down the line, other bazooka teams fired from behind dunes, trenches, and shell holes. Rockets whooshed out across the sand, trailing sparks. Some slammed into treads, others detonated against side plates or engine decks. The results were the same. Steel cracking, men screaming, and fire spilling from armored coffins. Japanese infantry, stunned by the sudden destruction, hesitated. Some dropped to the ground. Others tried to press forward, convinced the tanks had simply struck mines or been hit by artillery. Officers shouted for them to close in, to finish the Marines before they could regroup. Shiga, still atop his command tank, seized his binoculars with both hands. He scanned the American line, searching for the source of the devastation. The bazookas were invisible until the moment of fire, a flash, a plume, and then another tank struck down. He had scoffed at the captured tubes days earlier, telling his men they were crude launchers for signal flares or smoke charges. Now he watched as another Chiha convulsed in fire, its turret hatch blowing open like a kicked door. Closer to the beach, Sergeant Bill Kearney of Fox Company led another bazooka team along a shallow trench. They crawled past bodies and shredded packs, mud sticking to their helmets. Kearney popped up just enough to see a medium Chiha closing in, its hull gun cutting swaths across the defensive wire. "Range, 60 yards, he growled. His loader, Private Sam Ortiz, jammed a rocket into place. Kearney lifted the tube, braced it against the trench lip, and loosed the shot. The rocket flew true, striking near the engine compartment. A jet of fire blasted out the opposite side, and the tank's engine coughed before dying in a howl of tearing metal. Marine riflemen rose from their foxholes and poured fire into the infantry following the armor. Bars rattled, gerunds cracked, grenades arced through smoke and burst among charging soldiers. The Japanese advance, meant to be a thundering breakthrough, devolved into chaos. Inside one of the surviving tanks, a gunner named Kinoshita wiped soot from his faceplate and shouted down to his commander. They had been told American infantry possessed nothing that could breach their hull, not at this range. He could feel heat from the burning wrecks around them through the steel floor. He reached for the turret traverse crank, but his hands were slick with sweat and oil. In the black sky above the beach, flares finally hissed to life as U.S. mortarmen launched illumination rounds. White light spilled over the battlefield, casting the wrecked tanks in ghostly contrast. Smoke rose in twisting pillars. The silhouettes of bazooka teams could be seen darting between shell craters, reloading and firing with mechanical focus. Merrill wiped grit from his cheek and pointed toward a heavier silhouette rumbling through the trees. A Type 97, its commander exposed from the waist up, barked orders as the machine gun in the bow chattered. Navarro whispered, "That one's got thicker armor." Merrill didn't care. "Give me another round." Navarro slid the rocket home and smacked the launcher. Merrill rose to one knee, took aim at the tracks, and pulled the trigger. The rocket clipped a root mound, deflected upward, and struck the tank's turret base. The explosion sheared the commander's upper body clean from the hatch. The turret froze mid-rotation, flames pouring from the torn seam. Shiga's officers shouted contradictory commands across the radio net. Some called for a full retreat to regroup in the interior. Others demanded a direct charge to crush the Marine positions before more tanks were lost. The communications dissolved into panic. On the sand, Merrill and Navarro locked eyes, both breathing hard, both deafened by explosions. "We're not done," Merrill muttered, reaching for another rocket. The burning tanks turned the night into a flickering furnace. Flames spat from ruptured fuel tanks, casting wild shadows across the jungle fringe. Each explosion hammered home a truth the Imperial commanders had refused to accept. American infantry were killing armor at knife fight range. Lieutenant Colonel Sakai, Shiga clung to the side of his command tank as it lurched over churned sand. The air smelled of gasoline, molten rubber, and cooked metal. His driver yelled up through the hatch. 2 more vehicles had gone silent, and radio traffic was a tangle of confused reports and screams. Shiga's earlier confidence curdled into disbelief. How were infantry-mounted tubes tearing open armored hulls? He had personally inspected captured M1A1 launchers found on dead Americans. He'd held one in his hands, dismissing it as a fragile pipe meant for smoke or signal rockets. Another detonation to his right illuminated the carcass of a Chiha. Flames roared from the ruptured turret, and the commander's body hung halfway out of the hatch, motionless, hands charred to the rim. The psychological weight struck harder than artillery fire. Their armor was not invincible. On the Marine line, Sergeant Bill Kearney barked new firing angles between the crash of machine gun bursts. "Keep your heads down until they're close enough to touch." His loader Ortiz slid another rocket into the Bazooka's breech. The tube was warm, and both men were drenched in sweat and sand. They'd already knocked out 2 tanks and sent infantry scrambling for cover. Now they hunted the next silhouette through smoke and flame. Farther downslope, Private Navarro coughed out dust as Merrill adjusted position for a better line of fire. The cracked husks of 2 burning Type 95 spat sparks nearby, heat curling the edges of palm fronds overhead. Merrill whispered, "Where's the next one?" Navarro scanned, eyes stinging. He spotted movement through a haze of smoke. Another tank edging along the tree line, trying to turn their flank. "Right side, 70 yards, Navarro hissed. Merrill swung the launcher and braced his elbow on a splintered log. He could feel the thump of shells impacting elsewhere. Marines shouting, Japanese infantry charging in small pockets. Somewhere behind them, a corpsman yelled for stretchers. The Type 97 crept forward, turret slowly rotating. Its hull machine gun began stitching the sand with tracers, forcing Marines to duck. Merrill didn't. He steadied his aim and fired. The rocket slammed into the tank's forward slope, punching through the armor and sending a flash of fire up through the driver's hatch. The vehicle bucked once, engine shrieking, then sagged into silence. Navarro exhaled a single ragged laugh. To the Japanese infantry caught between burning metal and dug-in Marines, the battlefield had become unrecognizable. Some tried to crawl forward, tossing grenades into shell holes. Others huddled behind wrecks that were quickly turning into raging pyres. Officers screamed for them to press the attack, to ignore the explosions, to advance through the smoke. But every time a tank erupted, morale fractured further. Corporal Kinoshita, gunner in one of the few intact Chiha tanks, banged his fist against the turret wall. "We must break through now," he shouted to his commander. But the commander was silent. He'd been thrown back by a concussive blast, blood trickling from his nose and ears. Kinoshita could feel the heat rising through the floor. He reached for the radio handset, but static and shouts and overlapping voices made it useless. Lieutenant Colonel Shiga finally leapt down from his command vehicle, boots landing in hot sand littered with shell fragments. He waved his driver to back up. No more frontal push until they found the enemy's hidden artillery or anti-tank emplacement. He still refused to concede that handheld weapons were gutting his armor. He shouted to a runner to pull surviving tanks into a new formation and prepare for a second charge. But the Marines were already repositioning. Teams with bazookas darted between craters, using the burning tanks as visual cover. Riflemen laid down suppressive fire, pinning Japanese infantry who tried to regroup. The crack of Garans, the rattle of bars, the sharp bursts of Thompsons, all layered beneath the deep whoosh of each launched rocket. A flare drifted overhead, lighting the beachhead with ghastly clarity. The metallic carcasses of 8, maybe 9 tanks burned in twisted shapes. Their silhouettes, once symbols of unstoppable force, now stood as flaming monuments to shattered pride. Shiga stared at one wreck in particular, the first Type 95 that had gone up. He remembered mocking the American bazooka found on a dead corporal days prior, telling his staff officers it was more toy than weapon. His cheeks flushed with the heat and the humiliation. Behind him, a sergeant approached, bowing low. "Commander, should we fall back to the second line of defense?" Shiga clenched his jaw. "No retreat," he snapped, though his eyes betrayed calculation. He couldn't admit the battle plan was unraveling. On the Marine side, Merrill slammed the breech shut on another rocket and peered toward the tree line. Navarro wiped his blackened face with a torn sleeve. "Think they've had enough?" Merrill shook his head once. "They haven't figured it out yet." In the distance, the rumble of engines rose once more. Engines roared again from the tree line as the remaining Japanese armor regrouped for one last surge. The flames from the wrecked tanks cast a pulsing orange glow through the palms, illuminating silhouettes of vehicles repositioning in desperation. Shiga had ordered a staggered advance, no longer a broad frontal assault, but a spearhead meant to punch a narrow gap through the Marines' line before dawn could fully expose the debacle. 3 surviving Type 97 Chiha mediums and 2 battered Type 95s jolted forward, treads grinding over shattered palm trunks and the charred remains of their own infantry. Japanese soldiers, some with bayonets fixed and others clutching grenades, followed in scattered clusters. Their officers shouted themselves hoarse, invoking command, honor, and the Emperor, but their voices cracked with uncertainty. On the Marine front, the perimeter bristled with readiness. Foxholes were restocked with rockets and rifle clips yanked from the dead and wounded. Bazooka teams crouched low behind berms of churned earth and coral. Machine gunners reloaded belts with trembling hands, brass casings piled around their knees. Corporal Merrill wiped grime from his eyes and scanned the dim horizon. Navarro knelt beside him, breathing through clenched teeth, clutching 2 spare rockets like lifelines. The air felt tight, vibrating with the approach of steel. A tank's spotlight flared briefly, then died as it bounced over a crater. Another fired a burst from its hull machine gun, tracer rounds slicing the air just feet above the Marine foxholes. Sparks flew from rocks and metal fragments whined as they ricocheted. Marines ducked and returned fire in short, sharp bursts. Sergeant Kearney spotted the lead Type 97 breaching the smoke curtain. Its turret gun elevated and fired blindly into the night, searching for the position that had killed its companion minutes before. "There," Kearney barked. Ortiz fed him a rocket, and Kearney took aim with the grim calm of exhaustion. The shoulder-fired tube belched flame, and the rocket streaked across the sand. It slammed into the Chiha just above the track assembly. The explosion ripped the side armor, detonating the fuel tank. The vehicle heaved to one side and toppled partially into a shell hole, engulfed in fire. The infantry following it faltered. Some dove to their bellies. Others pressed on, unwilling to let the armor die alone. Grenades were hurled through firelight, their blasts muffled by the roar of burning vehicles. One Japanese soldier leapt atop a sandbag wall, only to be cut down by a Marine with a Thompson. To the left, another bazooka team led by Lance Corporal Hugh Callahan spotted a Type 95 zigzagging to avoid the burning hulks. The tank's commander sat half-exposed from the turret, scanning with binoculars. Callahan didn't wait, he fired at the turret ring. The rocket struck and tore the turret clean off, sending it spinning into the brush. The commander's body vanished in a fountain of sparks and smoke. The last 2 tanks pressed forward in a mad gamble. Behind one, a captain named Ito sprinted through the smoke with a sidearm and katana, screaming for his company to follow. Merrill watched through the haze, spotting the glint of steel and the shadow of the final Chiha closing the distance. "Navarro up," he growled. Navarro slid a rocket home. Merrill rose just high enough over the lip of the foxhole and took aim at the closing hulk. The Chiha fired its main gun. The shell screamed overhead and slammed into the sand dunes near the beach, throwing a geyser of sand skyward. Merrill stayed locked on his target and squeezed the trigger. The rocket streaked into the tank's front slope. This time, the explosion tore through the crew compartment and blew the turret hatch open with a concussive pop. The crew inside tumbled out aflame, their uniforms burning as they writhed on the ground. Japanese infantry nearby halted, their resolve buckling as their last armored shelter collapsed into molten ruin. Ito charged alone for another 20 feet before a Marine rifleman dropped him with a single clean shot. The katana fell from his hand and vanished into the sand. Silence fell in jagged fragments between occasional gunfire and the groan of burning metal. One final Type 95 sputtered to a halt, its engine coughing before flames rolled through the vents. The field was now a graveyard of twisted vehicles and scorched uniforms. Near the tree line, Lieutenant Colonel Shiga stood frozen, unable to reconcile the destruction with the decades-old doctrine he had built his faith on. His eyes reflected the inferno of his failed assault. He groped for explanations, hidden artillery, mines, sabotage, but none aligned with the smoking tubes he'd seen in Marine hands. Merrill lowered the empty bazooka and glanced down the line. Marines moved among craters, checking the wounded, reloading rifles and eyeing the jungle for any final push. Navarro slumped against a sandbag, chest heaving, staring at the remains of the last tank. The flames crackled louder than the wind. Smoke twisted into the night sky, carrying with it the myth of Japanese armored invincibility. By dawn, the sky over Saipan had turned a pale gray blue, streaked with the black columns of smoke rising from what was once a proud armored spearhead. The clatter of gunfire had dwindled to sporadic pops as Marines swept through the debris field, rifles at the ready, bayonets fixed. The sea breeze carried the stench of burning diesel, fused rubber, blood, and charred cloth, a smell that clung to every man who walked that ground. Corporal Jack Merrill sat on an ammo crate at the edge of a crater, the bazooka resting across his knees. Navarro crouched nearby, unwrapping a field dressing for a shrapnel cut on his forearm. Both men were silent, their ears still ringing from the night's relentless barrage. Merrill's eyes wandered over the twisted remains of a Type 97, its turret half melted into the sand. He remembered the laugh one of the prisoners had given when their platoon first unpacked bazookas on the island, like it was a joke. No one was laughing now. Further along the line, Marines dragged enemy wounded into shallow shade, disarming them and offering canteens of water. A few of the Japanese infantry, shell-shocked and covered in ash, stared blankly at the wreckage that was supposed to deliver them victory. Some clutched photographs or pilot scarves. Others whispered to themselves, unable to reconcile what they had seen. Near the tree line, Lieutenant Colonel Sakai Shiga stood amid the remnants of his command group. His field telephone lay broken at his feet, its receiver melted at the edges. Two of his aides were dead beside him. His once impeccable uniform was spattered with soot and ash. He stared at the burnt-out silhouettes of his tanks, the emblems of his regiment's pride now rendered hollow shells. A captain who had lost his voice during the night's chaos knelt in the sand, eyes fixed on the remains of a Chiha's track. He mouthed silent prayers. Another officer slumped beside a fallen palm trunk, fingers trembling around the hilt of his sidearm. They had prepared for artillery, naval gunfire, even aerial strafing. But the notion that infantrymen with shoulder-fired tubes could annihilate their armor had not existed in their doctrine. A Marine platoon sergeant named Clancy stepped over a tank, tread that had been blown off its mount, and came face to face with a Japanese lieutenant lying half-burned beside the road wheel. The officer, barely conscious, reached out a blackened hand toward the shattered hull and whispered a single word, something between disbelief and mourning. Clancy didn't understand it, but he recognized the tone, stunned ruin. Farther inland, the bodies of tank crews lay scattered near escape hatches that had sealed their fate. Some had tried to climb out and were cut down by fire or consumed by the inferno inside. A few Marines, hardened by years of Pacific warfare, paused at these sights not out of pity, but out of a grim acknowledgement. They had faced men who believed themselves unstoppable. Lieutenant Colonel Shiga finally spoke, his voice low and hoarse. He ordered what remained of his force to withdraw deeper into Saipan's interior to regroup. No one questioned the command. There was no argument, no bravado. The men moved like shadows, returning to a world that no longer made sense. In the Marine lines, the bazooka teams were being rotated off the front for rest and resupply. Merrill and Navarro walked past corpsmen tending to wounded radio operators and grenade gunners. A runner from the company HQ crossed their path and clapped Merrill on the shoulder without a word before jogging on. Ortiz and Kearney sat near a crater filled with seawater and ash. Ortiz stared at the tube they'd used until the firing contacts glowed red-hot from overuse. They thought these were toys, he muttered, as if the wreckage weren't proof enough. Merrill didn't answer. He looked out toward the smoldering line of carcasses, their armor pitted, their turrets blown open, their guns frozen in useless angles. Each destroyed tank was a rebuttal carved into steel. The Marines had not won through numbers or luck. They had won through a weapon the enemy refused to respect. As the sun climbed and shadows sharpened, salvage crews began marking wrecks and photographers snapped images of the battlefield for after-action reports. Officers traced shell impacts, measured blast sites, and collected fragments of bazooka rounds fused to armor plate for intelligence briefings. The Japanese survivors who could still move disappeared into the island's ridges and caves. Their confidence shattered. Their belief that American infantry couldn't stop armor had died in the flames that still smoldered across the beach. By midday, burial details moved among the dead, American and Japanese alike. Chaplains read last rites where they could. The wrecked tanks hissed and pinged as they cooled. Their once formidable silhouettes now monuments to arrogance undone. And somewhere in the shifting heat haze, the myth of invulnerable Japanese armor on Saipan dissolved into the sand. The bazooka crews hadn't just stopped tanks. They had broken an assumption etched into the enemy's command structure.